Reintroduction by Duncan J. Brown. Excerpts. The anchorman smirked as he dismissed Marjorie Lemming's reported sighting of a patch of blue sky. It had been 27 years since the sun last appeared over London. The guest meteorologist agreed the claim was absurd. She was, after all, a non-worker, or simply a non. Besides, Marjorie may well have had a drink, or worse, slapped on a sanctioned hit of heroin before appearing via halo screen on the show to make her ridiculous claim. Ever since the automation revolution, fewer and fewer people had jobs or contributed to the system. The gradual classification and eventual segregation of people into workers, non-workers, and the unregistered never received official approval. It was an organic process, and successive administrations across the globe adopted the terms and legislated accordingly. Robert Corrigan was watching from his favorite armchair in his old ground-floor flat, a residence situated in a part of town avoided by people of value. He flicked his wristpad, and the halo screen dissolved, and his gaze naturally drifted across to the window and out onto the street. The suffused sunlight was constant, whether it was daybreak, midday, or dusk. Time and the sun had become less well acquainted with one another once the doldrums had settled in. He had lived alone for longer than he cared to remember, and, if called upon to do so, would have struggled to pinpoint when he first realized he enjoyed solitude. No singular moment sparked an epiphany, and it was not a construct or a part of a wider strategy. It was a simple recognition of facts. His flat bore its abject neglect well enough. The walls had been painted French gray years before, a color scheme chosen with the help of a virtual salesman. He liked the front room with its large windows. The room had a fireplace, and he had spoken with the neighbor upstairs who had agreed to have the chimney cleared. She was a doughty old thing who had once been an Olympic gymnast. She'd returned from Beijing with a bronze medal, and the locals had taken to calling her Miss Champion. The name had stuck. 60 years later, she struggled to negotiate the stairs or remember to lock her door. An old grandfather clock marked each second with the resonance of age. The sound established a connection with an irretrievable past, a time Corrigan had read about in books and found a comforting distraction. The near-constant drizzle turned less well-maintained brick buildings green with lichen and moss. Corrigan could sense the damp as it crept closer. To keep it at bay, he periodically sent B4, his mecha butler, up to Miss Champion's flat to treat her walls and ceilings. B4's reports included a schedule for the continued maintenance of their home and those belonging to Corrigan's immediate neighbors. It was not always easy for the little droid to organize the necessary activities, as the neighborhood was populated by nons, political outcasts, or people who suffered from an aversion to androids. B4 appeared in the room, eager if somewhat unsteady on its roller, its large, doe-like eyes more irritating than ever. "I thought I powered you down," Corrigan huffed. The droid was approximately 4 feet tall. It coasted on a ball capable of negotiating stairs, had a pair of flexible arms, and a deep, officious voice. It came with an automatic reboot system, one Corrigan would have to disengage if he wanted the droid powered down indefinitely. Although he had chosen it from a range of variants, he'd never warmed to it. "You hibernated me," B4 said. Corrigan instructed it to prepare tea and toast, and the droid sped off toward the kitchen. He called after it, "I'll have breakfast in the front room." He sat up and swiveled and placed his feet in his slippers. The droid struggled to remember its core duties, those Corrigan had programmed with the young technician who delivered the device. Corrigan recalled the quality of the young man's skin, how smooth and perfect it was. He'd found it difficult to focus on the matter at hand and bungled the setup somehow. He threw on his bathrobe and paced through the kitchen to the front room. The cat must have remained on the window ledge all night. Its eyes were unflinching and far too big for its emaciated head. Corrigan sat in his armchair, but then returned to the kitchen to take his breakfast from the forgetful droid. and B4 followed him with a whir to the front room. He instructed the droid to clean. "And don't forget the flagstones in the garden," he snapped. "I nearly slipped on some algae yesterday." He placed the toast on the window ledge. The cat looked down at the melting butter, and its tongue poked out. Corrigan called B4 back and instructed it to put some genetically engineered tuna in a bowl and bring it to him. He made his way to the kitchen and collected the tuna from the droid. B4 lingered, so Corrigan dismissed it and went out into the communal hallway and unlocked the main door. The cat saw him and recoiled. He raised the manufactured tuna so the defeated animal could smell it. For a moment the cat remained wary, ready to creep away. Then hunger overwhelmed trepidation, and it dropped to the ground. Half an hour later, Corrigan was at the door, and B4 was deployed to keep Lazarus from escaping. He leant down into the harbor cab and assessed the driver, a man in his mid-30s in a much-worn brown leather jacket. The cabbie talked at a slow, considered pace about the weather and the most recent game of Elevator, a set of physical trials where transients competed for food, medical assistance, or the reinstatement of their status as nons. The cabbie assured him he thought it was nonsense, and hoped he didn't mind if he called it cruel. Corrigan waved the man's trepidation aside, aware of the nervousness any worker felt when questioning the way things had been arranged by Parliament. There followed a string of news updates borrowed from the latest broadcasts, including news that Marjorie Lemming had been arrested for political agitation. Corrigan listened and placed words like undesirable books on an archaic shelf. Dissident, transient, detainment, strength, freedom. The driver was an attentive listener and had absorbed the morning's propaganda without missing a syllable. The content and drift of his constant chatter were aligned with government policy, and it referenced no worrying texts, but his voice occasionally shuddered with suppressed emotion. It was as if the meaning he meant to convey, the covert message, was more emotional than intellectual. His gaze settled on his passenger, and Corrigan felt some dormant fervor stir and flit around the city where it rose around them. The cab hovered over the hospital before the driver brought it down beside the main entrance. Corrigan alighted, and the driver smiled through the window at him. Much to his chagrin, Corrigan was immediately ensnared, and he scowled, turned away, and walked into reception. B4 arranged a taxi for the morning of the interview, and Bawden collected him with his customary Polish punctuality. The cabbie mentioned having tried a lab-reared egg, and other than a slightly meaty taste to the yolks, he considered them first-rate. Corrigan had worked on a project for Origination Produce. Although real eggs and poultry were expensive, he could not stomach the thought of eating genetically engineered products once he'd seen how they were produced. Row after row of headless, featherless, legless hens puckered eggs out every 30 minutes, the disembodied birds connected to a program that regulated homeostasis for the lab-grown mutants. The same protein and carbohydrate gloop, a kind of porridge, was endlessly recycled and passed time and again through the digestive tracts of these purely functional, non-thinking or feeling organic machines. As Bawden was talking, he studied the back of the driver's head and his eyes in the mirror, and wondered why they had not pounced on one another. The lift descended far too quickly, and he inhaled and held his breath, his go-to safety mechanism for control of his stomach. Seemed like it was going to be a day of rapid descents. When the doors opened, a thin, sly-looking man in his early 60s was standing sentry. Corrigan recognized Draysk immediately from the day of his first interview. "I'm Draysk, we met," the man said in his tight German accent, and they shook hands. Again, Corrigan noted the skeletal fingers. "Professor Gers has not surfaced, and here I am. The longer I wait, the longer you take." Corrigan apologized and explained the driver had lost his way. Draysk assured him there was no need for explanation and said he hoped he had not had breakfast. Corrigan was still in possession of his tea and toast and wondered about the mention of breakfast. "The hell with toast! There's sausage!" Drask exclaimed, and took him by the arm and escorted him towards a large hall alive with conversation and elegant young servants with white gloves and silver trays. "Try it," the scientist said, grabbing a skewer, "and careful you don't impale yourself." He pulled a metal toothpick from his pocket and grinned. "You can do so much damage with one of these. Imagine the pain." At the front of the auditorium stood what Corrigan assumed to be an A-class Guardian. The android was still and was evidently powered down. It had an anthropomorphic form sheathed in a flexible black skin. Its head was a large oval, the surface of which gleamed beneath the overhead lighting. The body and limbs reminded him of an insect, a very large upright ant, perhaps, or a wingless dragonfly. Corrigan approached it and reached out to touch the machine. "No, no," Drask said. "Try the sausage, Mr. Corrigan." He held out the chipolata on a skewer. Corrigan took it and frowned. He tasted it. It was rubbery, but pleasant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Drask then announced, and the rumble of conversation quietened. "Herr Professor, Mr. Girth, is unable to attend this morning and has asked me to introduce our latest A-class Guardian model." The rumble resumed, and there was a polite surge towards the front of the auditorium. Drask powered up the android, and it walked out amongst the crowd, which parted here and there as it progressed. The scientist instructed the Guardian to perform a series of tasks, which included running, climbing a ladder, carrying one of the waiters across the room, relieving the waiter of his tray, and pouring coffee and tea for the guests. Its agility was remarkable, and Corrigan was impressed by how refined its movements were and by its overall elegance, even though he could not deny its insectile qualities. The head reminded him of the dragonflies he once caught when he was a boy. The Guardian's head had the same translucent surface, and the matter contained within the glassy dome was dense, impenetrable, and dark. He asked Drask who was controlling it. Adler wheezed from behind Corrigan's shoulder. "It operates itself, although it's not exactly a thinker." "No, it's a doer," Drask confirmed.